Greetings, friends, residents. This is a program for which we need to thank Helen Livingston. She has arranged for Joe Ingle to be here. She won't want to take credit for anything, so she's given me the honor of introducing Reverend Joseph B. Ingle to you. Joe was a sophomore at St. Andrews when I joined the faculty there. And when I joined it, I, within a few days, already knew the name Joe Ingle. All of you, I suspect, have been at schools when you recognize there are a few students that everybody knows. Well, at St. Andrews, Joe was that kind of student. Everybody knows him. And interestingly enough, he's made a life that people around the world know him too. He's one of these remarkable figures who, as a minister, has carved out his own church, as it were. Not a television minister, not what have you, but a ministry to prisons. Some people looking at what he's done would say, well, he's a prison chaplain. Joe's view on that was interestingly noted in a positive interview by the Vatican Press. As a sideline, I don't know whether any of you know any Protestant clergymen positively interviewed by the main publication service of the Catholic Church, but Joe is one of them. Joe said, no, in this interview, the prison chaplain is usually paid by the state and is responsible to the warden. He says, I am a minister of the United Church of Christ, and my church is the congregation of the condemned. And that's his church. Joe graduated St. Andrews, went to Union Seminary in New York, graduated there in 1971, and went to Nashville, Tennessee. Was that your home, Nashville?
No, I grew up here in North Carolina.
Okay, well, anyway, he deserted the Tar Heels and went to Nashville. Within a few years, he helped organize the Southern Coalition of Jails and Prisons and served as chair of that organization for a number of years. Under its auspices, he visited every prison death row in the South. Martha's here. How many of y'all have worked in Kairos? Oh my, Martha, you and I are the only ones. Anyway, yeah, right. I've served as anyway. In that process, in Alabama and Georgia, discovered that many prisoners in death row had no legal representation. So with some friends, he organized the Southern Center for Human Rights to provide legal representation to prisoners, condemned prisoners without lawyers. So it is my great honor to introduce Joe Ingle. And Joe, it's all yours. Folk get nervous about noon because lunchtime's there. But Joseph B. Ingle, give him a good.
So how's that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Yes, can you decrease the sound?
Maybe I'll just walk closer to you, Tom. How's that? Is that better? Okay. So first I want to thank Mac, because this is the guy who in Old Testament here at St. Andrews introduced me to J, D, E, and P, which are the four literary traditions the Old Testament is built upon. And I first learned about that through Mac. In other words, he teed me up for Samuel Terrian, an Old Testament professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, who was an amazing man. I spent many hours of study with him. I am particularly glad to be here and want to thank Helen for setting this up, because for me, this area is a special place in my heart. As I was driving down from Southern Pines this morning on 15501, the memories were flashing through me, and the pine trees. In Middle Tennessee, we don't have too many pine trees, and it was all coming back to me. And I wanted to share a couple of stories with you about my St. Andrews experience and what it led to for me. Obviously, it led to this book, which is now out. It's my fourth book. It's called Too Close to the Flame: With the Condemned Inside the Southern Killing Machine. And that's what it is in the South. We have a killing machine. There is no justice in this. That's a total illusion. You're there because not so much of the crime you committed, but the fact that you were poor and you're probably accused and convicted of killing a white person. So that's who the death penalty is reserved for in our country. So I record this in the book so you can meet people in prison who are on death row. And it's not a TV show. These are real people. And so you get to know them. And I'm going around talking about the book, and I'll be at the country bookstore. They're sponsoring an event this afternoon at 5:30. Had a nice little write-up in the Pilot yesterday. We'll just pass that around. And it's going to be at the Congregational Church in Southern Pines, in case any of you want to make it. It'll be a totally different experience than what we're going to talk about this morning, so I promise not to bore you if you come. But my St. Andrews experience went like this. I graduated from high school in Raleigh at Ingle High School in the spring of 1964. At that point, I and my buddies, Bruce and Jimmy Washburn and Philip Upchurch, had decided we're not mature enough to go to college. We realize that. Let's just join the service and then we'll do college after that. And we'll be ready to do it. And I explained this theory to my mother. And my mother looked at me and said, "You're going to college." I said, "Wait a minute, Bruce and Jimmy and I and Philip, we've got all this worked out. We'll join the service together, we'll grow up, and then we'll do college." She said, "No, you're not doing that. You're going to college." So I had two choices. I had the University of North Carolina or St. Andrews. And my mother said, "You're going to St. Andrews." Okay. So my first experience of St. Andrews was when I walked on the campus to attend orientation, 4 classes, in August of 1964. I had not even been on campus before I showed up to matriculate. And 4 years living in Winston-Salem dormitory, room 217. And I just had an incredible experience here. I can't begin to define it accurately for you, but I came in here as a good Presbyterian lad and hit something called Christianity in Crisis. Christianity in Culture, which is this. We'll pass this around. This is the sophomore syllabus of Christianity and Culture. And this was an interdisciplinary curriculum constructed by the faculty, including Mac Douglas, to expose all the students to, really, the history of culture and Christianity as it developed in the Western world. And then your junior and senior year, you could actually look at other religions and other cultures. Interdisciplinary talk. Now, I didn't realize how unique this was because I just showed up and I participated and I enjoyed it and I had a great experience. And I majored in philosophy and religion and was taught by a man named Bill Alexander. and his wife Kay, two wonderful people who had a huge impact on my life. But I graduated in '68, and as a matter of fact, if you'd like to learn more about what my experience at St. Andrews was, I wrote a little book here for the St. Andrews Press. It's called Rock the Boat, which details a lot of the things we did. We were involved in working against the Vietnam War. The students were. We were involved in trying to implement student power. We were involved in being for civil rights. And I'll share one story about this. The spring of '68, we're headed toward graduation, and we're locked in a battle with the college administration on a lot of issues. Because we want to throw in loco parentis out the window. We felt like we could certainly decide whether we wanted to drink or whatever we wanted to do. We're old enough to make these decisions. We don't need the college telling us this. So all these student power battles were going on. And one night, two of my dear friends, a guy named Art Gatewood, who went on to be a Presbyterian minister, and Bob Devlin, who went on to be a great street musician in Washington, D.C., were in their dorm, and it was Mecklenburg, and they were thinking, we really need to express how we're feeling here to the Board of Trustees who are coming in this weekend. So how can we do that? And they thought, well, we've got this wall over there. We could paint on the wall. And so they carefully figured out how to do that, because the security person at that time, we fondly called Jet Jackson. We didn't know his real name, but he would make the rounds, and they figured out when he made his rounds, got their bucket of paint, went to the wall, and painted "Rock the Boat" on the wall, so the Board of Trust would see, hey, you know, we need to rock the boat here. We need to make some changes. We need to stir things up. Now, as Mac pointed out, a lot of people knew me when I was here. I was here for 4 years. It was a small campus. You couldn't help but know people. But also, people like to think maybe I did stuff that I didn't do, like paint that wall. These were my friends. It wasn't me. And so we graduate, and I'm so exhausted because I've been involved in not only the academic part, but all the student changes and everything. And I just want to go off to the summer and be my camp counselor at a Presbyterian camp outside of Richmond, Virginia, Camp Hanover. It was a great camp, and it's my third year of being a camp counselor. And I was in the woods. St. Andrews was behind me. At that point, I didn't want to ever hear the name St. Andrews again. I was so tired of it. And I'm in the woods, and all of a sudden, the camp director's wife comes into the woods. Now, that's pretty rare. And she comes over to me and says, "You have a long-distance phone call." Well, I immediately thought of my grandmother, who reconstructed my soul after my father died when I was 7. We moved in with her, and she really saved my life. I was in the 3rd grade. And I figured, my mama is probably dying. I knew she was sick, and that's the only reason anybody would call me up here in the woods. So I went to the camp director's house, and I answered the phone, expecting to hear a female voice, probably my mother or somebody talking about my mama. And I said, "Hello." And I heard this male voice say, "Is this Joe Ingle?" "Yes." "This is Tom Belk, chairman of the board of St. Andrews Presbyterian College." Well, I just kind of scrambled my mind a little bit. I mean, I'm expecting to hear about my grandmother, and Tom Belk's on the other line. And I said, "Well, how can I help you?" And he said, "I want to talk to you about this wall." And I said, "Okay." And I'm trying to get my mind around the fact that I'm talking to the chairman of the board. He said, "This is a destruction of private property. You can't do things like this. You're ruining the campus. You're ruining the reputation." He went on for about 90 seconds or so, and finally he stopped. And I thought, okay, if he's calling me Joe, I'm going to call him Tom. So I said, "Tom," I said, "Tom, you need to look at it like this. What's going on in this country? You have students taking over universities, presidents' offices. You have strikes. You look at the Sorbonne in Paris, they've shut it down. And what are we doing at St. Andrews? We are writing on a wall symbols of protest, nonviolent. And by the way, it's not destroying anything. You can go there and take a rag and wipe all this stuff off. It's no big deal. But it gives us an outlet to express what we're feeling. And by the way, you taught us to think like this through the curriculum at St. Andrews. You taught us critical thinking. We are using our critical thinking powers to challenge the Vietnam War, to say yes to civil rights, to move on in a Christian manner where this country needs to go. You taught us through the St. Andrews curriculum. Long silence at the other end of the line. Finally, Tom Belk says, well, I guess we'll agree to disagree. And we hung up. The wall continued, as you know, all the way to the end. So I tell you that story because it's a great example of what the ferment was like when I was here and how creative it was and what a magical time it was. But I did not appreciate the true quality of my education until I arrived at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And I went there because they had something called the East Harlem Urban Year Program. You could live and work in East Harlem and also take classes at Union. At that point, I was pretty alienated from the South. I'd been for civil rights. I'd been against the Vietnam War. A lot of people around me wanted me to get the hell out of there. So I did. I went to New York. And I loved East Harlem. It was a class ghetto, 45% African American, 45% Puerto Rican, 10% everybody else. I roomed with Sam Williams from the Panhandle of Texas, and we were on East 105th Street in a tenement. And it was a wonderful experience. I'm taking my classes at Union. And so I spent that summer working at Union with Daniel Day Williams, who was the leading theologian in process theology in the United States, and along with Alfred North Whitehead in England, one of the leading philosophical minds about process theology in the entire world. And so I'm meeting with Dan Williams, getting to know him, because I'm writing my thesis on Martin Heidegger. Because Bill Alexander had taken me all the way through Western philosophy, and I had studied everybody in Western philosophy except Heidegger. So that was what I was going to do for my senior master's thesis at Union. So I'm meeting with Dan Williams about this, and we have a pleasant summer going over Heidegger. And then fall comes, and I'm up to take my first class at Union Theological Seminary, New York City. Well, I don't know what I was thinking, but when I walked in that classroom, I sat down, and we had introductions. All these folks come around and say, well, I went to Harvard, I went to Yale, this one guy went to Oxford. I mean, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into here? And so I sat there for 2 weeks as Dan taught his class on contemporary conceptions of God, just sort of taking it all in. And after a 2-week period, Dan Williams said to me, Joe, why don't you come with me after class? Well, that's never a good sign when the professor says, come to me after class. So I get with Dan and we go to his office. And he sits me down and he says, Joe, why haven't you said anything in my class for 2 weeks? I said, Dan, look, I pretty much went to school in a cotton patch. I mean, we were pretty much surrounded by cotton fields, and I feel like I had a good education down there, but I am in high cotton now. These people in this class, I'm just taking it in. I mean, they're from all these elite institutions, and I'm from this little Presbyterian school in North Carolina. And this is what Dan Williams told me. I'll never forget this. And this lets you know what St. Andrews was. This is not about me. This is what St. Andrews Presbyterian College was. He looked at me and he said this. You know more than anyone else in this class. And you have a critical perspective that's better trained than anyone else in this class. And I want to hear from you. That was St. Andrews. And I have carried that gift with me to this day. To Rome, to wherever, to death houses, to governor's offices, to archbishop's offices. I have carried that gift with me that St. Andrews gave me. And so, yeah, I'll go talk to the damn governor, and I'll tell him exactly what the deal is with the death penalty. And yes, I'll talk to the bishops. I'll talk to anybody about it, because I know what the issues are, and I know what's driving it, and we have to face these issues because we care as citizens and Christians about what is happening in our country. But all of that is possible because of St. Andrews. And so I just wanted to share that with you so you could get a feel for it. And you might be thinking, okay, so how does that translate into this work you do? Let me give you a couple of examples. We'll start with a funny one. Elaine Pagels, for years, was a professor of history of religion at Princeton. And so if you haven't read her books, please read her books. Start with Why Religion, because that's her own personal account of how she came into religion. And she's a wonderful person. And we'd exchanged emails, and I arranged for her to come down to Tennessee's death row last November. And this is one of the things. Don't be alarmed because I'm crying. It's because I've experienced a lot of trauma through this work, and I'm dealing with it. I've been in trauma therapy. But one of the consequences is I randomly cry sometimes. But it's nothing to be concerned about. I just have to wipe the tears away. So Elaine came down in November. See, we've arranged to take her out to the prison, to death row. And you have to understand, we've really developed a unique death row there in the sense it's programmed. We've had the Episcopal bishops funding EFM out there, which is an education for ministry for all the guys on death row. They've taken all 4 years of that. We have people come in from around the country to meet with the guys. And so we arranged for Dr. Elaine Pagels to come down from Princeton. So I know we're going to, part of the things you realize when you deal with prisons is there's always a problem. So I knew we had our group going into the prison, and I'm there, and I knew there would be some problem for sure. And yes, we're there, and we had a group of people going in with Elaine, including a young man called Austin French. Austin French had finished college. He was on a gap year, and he was trying to figure out whether he wanted to go to seminary or whether he wanted to go to law school. Austin French is David French's son. David writes a column for the New York Times. You may see it. And so he wanted to come in, and so I said, well, sure. So we're there, and they're going over the list of everybody at checkpoint, and they say, this guy can't come in. It's Austin. That's because the associate warden didn't want him to come in. And I'd already talked to the warden about all this, right? Warden, associate warden. There's a level here of authority. But the warden wasn't there, but I had his cell phone. So I stepped outside, called the warden's cell phone, told him what the problem was. He called checkpoint. We all go back. And we get back to death row. The guys are so excited to have Elaine Pagels there. And sitting around a big circle. And they're saying, Dr. Pagels, we really appreciate you coming. And we'd just like to start by everybody introducing themselves. So, you know, everybody introduces themselves to Elaine, and her husband Alan's there. And they all do the introductions, and we're there to talk about the Gospel of Thomas because she translated the Gospel of Thomas. And so the guys are all excited about that. And they get to Elaine's husband and say, well, so, Alan, what did you do? And he said, well, I was in the music business on the West Coast. And they say, oh, what instrument did you play? I didn't play an instrument. Oh. So there you can see the level of curiosity going up. So what did you do if you were in the music business and didn't play an instrument? He said, well, I managed the Grateful Dead. The guys went, what? So one of them says, I'm going to use you as a demonstration, okay? Hold up your right arm. One of the guys says, Elaine, or they actually called her Dr. Pagels. Dr. Pagels, we had you way up here because you were coming to meet with us. But now that we've met Alan, stand up. We think Alan's way up here. So we were having this great time, and the prison chaplain comes in. Now, one of the things you have to understand about prison chaplains is most of them are dear souls, but they work for the state, and he's responsible to the warden. He comes in with this little list of things, and he looks around, and he says, "This is not on my list." I said, "Yes, I know. I set it up with the warden. This is Dr. Elaine Pagels from Princeton, and we're here discussing the Gospel of Thomas." The chaplain's jaw drops, and he looks up with us like, "Oh my God," and says, "We're not endorsing the Gospel of Thomas, are we?" I said, we're just discussing the Gospel of Thomas. It freaked him out, and he left. But we had a wonderful time, and Lane and Alan left, and it was just a great time, and the guys are in correspondence with her now. So those are the kind of things you do, where you can have really meaningful conversation. We have a visitation on death row program in Nashville, where people are matched from the outside with someone on the inside. It's volunteer. Everybody who wants a visitor is matched. We do an orientation. We're doing our next orientation on November 15th, where we'll explain to the outside visitors what it's like, match them up, and they'll begin visiting on death row. So there's a lot of positive things going on. Having said that, let's look at the negative. The South has more people on death row than any other country in the Western world. Just the South. We've executed more people in the South than any other country in the Western world. When I go to Europe and other places internationally and talk about the death penalty, they are appalled that this country is so barbaric as to have the death penalty. And I can't argue with them. I'm appalled too. So what we have to understand is what is driving this killing system. And we had an example in this state 2 Fridays ago when your governor, Josh Stein, whose father, Adam Stein, is one of the premier civil rights attorneys in this freaking country, and who now lives at Carroll Woods in retirement, he and I went up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals fighting for Velma Barfield when she was set for execution in November 2nd, 1984. Adam Stein and I drove up there together, and Adam and Dick Burr and I worked on Velma's final appeal. This guy is a jewel, and his son is the governor. So the Republicans had seized upon this murder, this awful murder that occurred in Charlotte this summer, where this Ukrainian young woman was murdered. And they saw a political opportunity, which is what we're talking about, the death penalty. It's all about politics. And so they crafted this bill that will speed up the appellate process in North Carolina of death penalty appeals, and also multiple option your way of killing someone. So if the lethal injection process is stopped by a court because of concern about drugs, which it has been in North Carolina, because you can't have a good lethal injection, that's a that's a non sequitur. They're horrific. So this bill allows you to choose any other method that any other state uses. Firing squad, gas chamber, hanging. Your pick in North Carolina, you get to choose. So this bill comes to Josh Stein's desk, who's a Democrat. One thing I learned long ago, that everybody in politics is an equal opportunity killer, Republican or Democrat. When I met with Bob Graham in the governor's office in Florida in the spring of 1979, a UCC layman, and I'm a UCC minister. He's a Democrat. He had the largest death row in the United States. He went on to sign 155 death warrants. So it's politics. And so Josh Stein has this bill on his desk, and this is what Josh Stein knows. He knows he can veto this bill, but it will be overridden because you've got a lot of Republicans, almost a supermajority in your legislature. And not only that, 15 Democrats voted for this bill. So he also knows there are going to be some Democrats who will vote for the override. So he signs it. It's a great example of the politics of state killing. Democrat, Republican, speed up the appeals, change the method of execution. Let's get on with it in North Carolina. Now in Tennessee, we're about to have our 4th execution this year on December 11th. Wayne Nichols, who shouldn't even be on death row because of the crime. He was not a first-degree murder, but one of the things you realize that these folks don't have good lawyers, and as Steve Bright, one of the legendary death penalty lawyers, has always said, Joe, it's like this. It's not who commits the worst crime, it's who has the worst lawyer. That's who gives you the death penalty, and that's really true. And so Wayne Nichols had a terrible lawyer, and he's going to be executed, and he's opted for electrocution. Because we have learned in Tennessee, in the previous executions we've had, that the lethal injection is so awful, as Justice Sotomayor says on the U.S. Supreme Court, it is a combination of chemical burning and waterboarding. So he's opting for electrocution, not because it's humane, but because, as he says, it'll only take a couple of minutes, whereas this thing over here is going to take 20 minutes, and I'm going to be suffocating and drowning and also burning at the same time. So he's opting to get electrocuted. So that's what we're up against. And given where we are politically, nationally, it's not getting any better. And that's just the realities. Now, I'm going to share Alvin Ford with you because Alvin, you see a lot of things when you go into these prisons. Alvin Ford was unique. He was on Florida's death row. Alvin was there for killing a policeman in Fort Myers, Florida, a crime he committed, no doubt about it. He comes to death row, and when we first visit Alvin, which is around 1976, the Florida law was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 76. It was passed in 74. So Alvin came in 76, or maybe early 77. When we visited Alvin, he was a little depressed. He was slightly depressed. But you could have a conversation and talk about his family and where he was from. But as the months went on and his appeal goes up, he got more and more withdrawn until finally Governor Graham signed his first death warrant. So in Florida, when the governor signs your death warrant, you're taken to Q Wing, and you're there for 30 days, and the only way you get out of Q Wing is, one, something stops the execution like a court order, because the governor's already denied clemency, or two, they take you to the death chamber and kill you. So that's the only way you're getting off a Q Wing. So there's, Alvin's going through his first death warrant, and he comes out of that totally bonkers. He's not speaking in a way that you can understand him. He's totally crazy. So he comes off of that, goes back to the regular death row, and then Graham signs his second death warrant. So Alvin Ford's second death warrant was in the spring of 1984. I'm with James Adams on death watch at the Florida State Prison. James is set for execution. This is May 9th. James is set for execution at 7 a.m. the next morning. James was completely innocent. He was from Covington, Tennessee, African-American guy. And I'm talking to James, and I said, and he's worried about Alvin. Because Alvin's, 4 cells down and just babbling madness. He says, Joe, you got to help Alvin. I said, James, we're going to help Alvin. But right now, I want to just focus on you. We just have this night together and that's it. So let's just focus on you. And he said, okay. And I said, so has there ever been a time when you felt like you were going to die? He said, yeah. I hadn't thought of this in years. I was a kid, and we were living outside of Covington, and we lived in a shack, and I was on the bed. I was very, very sick. My mom and dad were there. My brother and sister were there, and all of a sudden, I don't know what this was, but I rose up out of my body. I mean, my body was still there, but I was up, looking down on this scene with my mother and father and with my brother and sister. I could see the cracks in the floorboards, and the chickens underneath the floorboards where they lived. And it was like, I don't know how to explain it. I just had this experience, and then I felt like somebody tugged me at my ankles, and I came back to my body. And when I did that, I was back to myself. And he said, "Is that what you're talking about?" I said, "That could be." And he said, "That's really good. I haven't thought about that." So when they took James to the electric chair the next morning and strapped him in there, he was hanging on to that image he had as a child. That's what was carrying him through that event. Meanwhile, Alvin Ford's babbling away. This was May 10th, and he's set for execution on May 30th. I had to go home because this whole thing with James had wiped me out. I went home, regrouped with my wife for a while, and came back for Alvin Ford. Because, the state of Florida had appointed 3 psychiatrists, because we said this man's not competent, to examine Alvin. They found him competent. This is what a conversation like Alvin Ford went with. "Alvin, how are you doing? R2, D2, Pope 3, Destiny, Pipe Alley." Just a code of indecipherable words. He was not coherent. And they found him competent. That's when I realized the whole Hippocratic oath had gone by the board in Florida. If you could find this guy competent so you can kill him. So we had it on appeal, and lo and behold, at 1 in the morning, he's set for execution at 7 a.m., the U.S. Supreme Court stopped the execution to consider, for the first time in the history of constitutional law in the United States, remember we're talking about May of 1984, whether it's constitutionally permitted to execute the insane. Up to that point, it was. So we go in to see Alvin the next morning. Now, Alvin had not eaten while he was on death watch. So he'd been on death watch 30 days. He was skin and bones. And he's sitting there, and he's there, I'm here, Margaret Vandiver's here, Gail Rowland's here, 2 paralegals, and we're trying to communicate with Alvin to let him know he's not going to be killed. And we try, and it's the same stuff, the same indecipherable code, which he has gone into this level of madness that helps him to navigate death row, but it doesn't help the rest of us communicate to him. And the morning goes on, and we're getting tired, and I said, we're in a little room here, and I said, I'm just going to step out here. And so I step out of the room and just stretch. It's about 11 o'clock, and the prisoners, they're called runners, are coming around with the lunch trays for the people in the visiting area so that prisoners can have lunch. And this guy comes up with his trays. I stopped him. I said, "Why don't you give one of those trays to Alvin?" This guy looked at me. "You must be crazy, man. He hadn't eaten in 30 days. I said, "Let's just put a tray in here." So we opened up the door. I went in, put the tray at Alvin's feet. The guy left, and I said, "Alvin, we're going to have a prayer." So we all held hands. Alvin's shackled like this. He's got handcuffs, a chain to his waist, a chain around his waist. His feet are shackled. But we hold his hands, and we have a prayer. And I thank God for saving his life, ask a blessing on him and his mother, and ask us to sustain us through this madness, and do an amen. At which point, Alvin Ford leans over, picks up the tray, puts it on his lap, and eats food with his hands for the first time in 30 days. Gail wept, Margaret wept, I wept. It was incredible. Alvin Ford became a landmark case in constitutional law. Ford versus Wainwright. You cannot execute the insane in the United States of America. He later died on Florida's death row. So that's kind of the keyhole I'm trying to give you in this book so you can see what's actually going on here. This is not a TV show. It's not entertainment. These are real people. And they're all poor. And they're all disenfranchised. And I'm going to close by sharing And then I want to have questions because I know we're getting toward noon and you want to eat lunch. This is a guy, Ed Zagorski, who is a terrific human being. He's on death row for 35 years in Tennessee for a crime he did not commit. Ed was involved in the marijuana business. And I don't mean just handing out a joint here and there. They were shipping bales of marijuana up from Louisiana into Hickman County, Tennessee, and selling it, especially to the music business people in the early 80s. And he's minding his own business doing this stuff, and all of a sudden he gets caught up in some circumstances and 2 people get killed. Ed didn't kill them. Long story short, he gets charged with the killings. They want him to talk about his drug business. He's just really a junior in the drug business. The guys who actually run it are down in New Orleans. And he's not giving up any names. And they get mad and they say, we're going to charge you with the death penalty if you don't give us the names of the people who are in charge of it. He said, I ain't giving you names. So this is what they do to Ed. In June, they build a metal box. It is 8 feet tall, and it's about 4 feet this way, and comes this way, and put it in the cell in the Sumner County Jail. It is unair conditioned in the Sumner County Jail. And they put Ed in that box. So he is in the summer Tennessee heat in a metal box for 120 days, trying to get him to talk about who really runs this marijuana business. And if they had taken the time to get to know Ed Zagorski, they would know he would never talk. He never did. But he comes out of that, they take him to the trial, and he gets the death sentence. They ignore the conditions he was confined under. Yeah. You can't make this stuff up, people. So he comes to death row where he is for 35 years. And then we get to the fall of 2018. Now, I'd seen Ed and I'd seen another fellow on Maundy Thursday in spring of 2018. Don Johnson and Ed Zagorski came out at the death row in Tennessee. Don asked me, Joe, will you be with me at the end? You know, I just want to have you with me. I said yes. And then later on that same day, Ed says, will you be with me at the end? It's not anything religious necessarily. It's just I want to have my last conversation with you. I said, sure. So I come home realizing I've just committed to 2 death watches on one afternoon. Becca says, my wife, do you want to go to the foot washing service at church? I said, I don't think so. I think I'm just going to stay here and just try to sort through what I've agreed to do. And so Ed comes up for execution that fall. Now, the first death watch in Tennessee, you're moved to a separate unit from the prison. Where in Q Wing, it's a separate unit. In Florida, you're there for 30 days. In Tennessee, you're in this unit for 72 hours prior to your killing. So they move Ed there, and I can go see him all 3 days he's there. And so I see him from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, both days, and then we get to the final day. And so I drive out to the prison. I'm going to see him from 3 to 5. They're going to kill him at 7 p.m. And so we're having our visit, and one of the most macabre things about this whole process, here's a guy who's been on death row for 35 years, and as he says, you remember this? And he does his wrist like that. I said, yeah. He said, that was 1990. My wrist wasn't moving, and you came out here and you looked at that wrist and you said, I think I can get a doctor for you, because the prison gives terrible medical care. And I got Dr. Rob Stein to come out, and he saw what was going on with Ed's wrist and gave him a prescription. And Ed said, you know, Dr. Stein said, take these pills for 90 days. After 30 days, I was feeling pretty good, but I took them for another 30, and I'm feeling great. And I started to stop, and then I said, nope, Dr. Stein said 90 days, so I took them for 90 days, and now look, no problem. I haven't had a problem for years. I said, that's great, Ed. So he's really excited about reviewing that with me on his death watch. And we're having a final visit just before he gets killed, and there's a knock on the door behind me. The door opens, there's a guard. I'm his spiritual advisor. I have a right to be with him. I mean, the warden agrees, everybody agrees, I got a right to be there. I had to go to court to win this a few years ago, but it's all taken care of. And the guard says the visit's terminated. Terminated? What do you mean? The warden says it's over. You got to leave. They come get Ed, put the shackles back on him, say, Ed, come on, you need to talk to your lawyer. So Ed goes that way, I go out. I get out to the parking lot where the press is. They're all packing up, so I know something's happened, but nobody's told me. And so I asked a press member, what's going on? They said, the governor stopped the execution. I said, why? They're not sure the electric chair will work. They stopped the execution 2 hours before they're going to put him in there because they're not sure it's going to work. They didn't care about Ed. As a matter of fact, the Tennessee Supreme Court in 48 hours set a new execution date for November 1st of 2018, 18 days hence. So later I go in and we're doing the same thing. And we go through our first 2 days, and the thing about this is you're on death row for all these years, right? Your health care is minimal at best. But while you're on death watch, this 72-hour period, they send a nurse in every afternoon, and the nurse comes in, feels your pulse, puts a stethoscope on your chest, draws blood, kind of gives you a mini physical. They do that Friday, they do that Saturday, and they do that Sunday before they kill you. You get better medical care in the 72 hours before they kill you than you do the whole time you're on death row. So when I'm having the visit with Ed, I'm watching the nurse do this. It's just mine. It's dissonance. You just can't believe it. And so Ed was just a straight up guy. I can't tell you that. A lot of these guys operate on a convict code. And it's very simple. Their word is their bond. There are people in prisons I know across the South who have saved my life countless times that I don't even know about because they know who I am and what I stand for. And their word is their bond. And they say, Ingle's all right, you leave him alone. It's as simple as that. Ed Zagorski was one of those guys. If Ed told you he was going to do something, consider it done. No problem. No matter what you may ask him, if it's in his possibility to do it, he will do it. So this is the guy I'm working with, and you just can't imagine how I feel like as I'm watching him getting prepared to be killed. And I want to share this with you. So Ed's there. It's like 5 in the afternoon. They're going to kill him at 7, and I'm about to really have 5 minutes left with him. So I've come in. We're talking. We're having the visit, and we get toward the end, and this is what he says. Joe, I have to tell you about the dream I had last night. I can't believe it. He's excited. You know about my fantasy of the afterlife. And I did. Women in bikinis no older than 21. A Harley and no cops. I nodded. He chuckled. Yeah, I understand it. He said, well, last night I slept soundly and I had a dream about what I think the afterlife is really like. Now, in our previous visits, Ed had shared that he was in love with a woman named Laurie in his youth, and it just didn't work out for whatever reason, but he always cared about her. And he told his lawyers about her, and they had found her gravestone and brought him a picture. And that meant the world because he knew he couldn't do anything else. That was Laurie, but he still cared for her. He said, I saw Laurie, the woman I cared for so much years ago. She was waiting for me after this. She reached out and took my hand, and we walked across a grassy area. Grass is important because when you're on death row, you never touch grass. You're always on concrete. She told me everything was going to be all right. It was an incredible feeling, peaceful. Then she told me to hold tight. She squeezed my hand, and I held hers tightly. Then we took off. We were flying. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't afraid, but it felt strange. Then I saw trees ahead. We were headed right for them. I pointed them out to Laurie. I thought we would smash into them, but she didn't seem concerned, and we flew right through them. We came out on the other side and landed. We were back on the green grass again. Ed was bubbling with excitement as he shared the dream. Ed, I said, that seems more like a vision than a dream. And they came and they electrocuted him 2 hours later. So that's enough for me. Thank you so much for your time, and I want to answer any questions you may have. Yes?
You said that you experienced trauma, obviously, and that you are experiencing trauma therapy.